Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Sabine Nöbel. She is a postdoc at the Martin Luther University, Halle, Wittenberg, in the group Animal Ecology. Her background is in the behavioral ecology of Poeciliids and Drosophila, studying non-genetic inheritance of mating preferences using mate copying, by which females build mating preferences by observing and copying conspecific females' mate choice. She studies how new socially learned mating preferences can invade the population and persist across generations, and she's also the secretary of ESLR, the Association of Early Career Social Learning Researchers Society, and Early Career Network for all things around social learning and cultural evolution. And today we're going to talk about social learning, mate copying, and related topics. So, Dr. Nobel, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Ricardo.
Great. Okay. So, social learning then. How do you approach it from an evolutionary biology slash behavioral ecology perspective? And how would you say we can determine that a particular species has social learning?
Yeah, so social learning in general is when any individuals observe their conspecifics and then use this information they gain to change their own behavior. And I think this is a very intelligent way to easily get information about the environment without exploring it on your own and taking all the risks involved with that. And yeah, so you gain a lot of benefits from social learning, and this can, of course, shape the evolution. And yeah, studying social learning is not that easy because often it's things that the individuals could also probably learn on their own, but they are just taking this shortcut into using the information from others. So like foraging, probably they would find a food patch on their own, but it would take them much more time to find it. So it's easier just to watch where the others are feeding and then going to the same patch.
Yeah, but I mean, about the second part of my question, I mean, how do you study social learning in particular species, and how can you tell if particular species have social learning or not?
So for example, in the flies, what we do is we show them the mate choice of another fly and
Yeah.
see if they choose the same one. Or then we have another group, the control group, and we see what they do. And when these two groups differ, we know that they are using social information.
Right. And we will get, of course, more into the specifics of that when we talk about mate copying, for example, which is one example of social learning. But social learning can also be stable or plastic, right? So,
Sure.
and what does that mean exactly? What does it mean for social learning to be stable or plastic?
I mean, it could be that you observe one thing, you learn it, and then you stick to this. And no matter how the environment change, you will always perform the same action. But with plasticity, I would say that then you measure your environment and you observe everything around you. And when you see that a different behavior is now more beneficial than the one you used before, then you adapt your behavior again. So it's not that it's a one-time learning event, it's lifelong learning that you always update your
Right.
behavior.
Right. And I mean, of course, I would imagine that these we would have to look at these on a case by case basis. I mean, looking at different behaviors. But I mean, do we know why certain why sometimes social learning is stable and other times it's plastic? and why certain behaviors are more stable and others more plastic? Do you have any idea about that?
At least to my knowledge, it's not really well understood when it is plastic or when it is stable. I mean, there are other or learning mechanisms that are way better understood, like imprinting or song learning in birds, where you often have a sensitive phase, and during that phase you acquire the knowledge and then you perform it for the rest of your life. But with other mechanisms or processes, it's less well known. But I guess it also depends a lot, but on the context. Like about foraging, you should better be plastic in your social learning than stable, so that you can always adapt to the new circumstances.
Right. So perhaps it's easier for us to get into the specific case of mate copying and go through all of the things we know about it, or at least the work you've been doing on Drosophila, for example. So first of all, what is mate copying?
So mate copying is when individuals, often females, use the social information provided by their conspecifics about the mate quality of other males, and then use this information to build their own mating preferences. So if you imagine that one naive female is observing another female mating with a big guy, you also go for the big guy because you see the big guy is better than the small one. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's very widespread in the animal kingdom, and we know it from many, many species nowadays.
And how common is it across animal species? Do we know that?
I mean, there are more and more species tested where they found it. So like in rats, there are spiders. I recently saw a paper even about an octopus, many bird species, most prominently maybe the fish examples. And yeah, more and more species are now tested and they find it. But there are also examples that don't copy, and it's not really clear why some species do it and others not. So up to now in meta-analysis, they couldn't find a clear pattern, like you have to be monogamous or polygamous or provide parental care or whatever. So up to now, we can't see a clear pattern. So more species need to be tested.
Okay, so you study Drosophila specifically, and before we get into how mate copying operates in that specific species, so what is it a good animal model for? Because Drosophila is in fact an animal model that is used for many kinds of things, correct?
Yes. So, I mean, the whole genome is sequenced, so you can, it's used a lot also for medical research, in development, neurobiology, so in many, many different fields, and not so much in the behavioral domain yet. But it offers a lot of opportunities as a model organism. There are all these genetic tools, and nowadays you can even order your customized Cas9 flies with the mutations you want.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's really fascinating. And the other thing is they are really cheap if you want to breed them, and you can time them just based on temperature, how quick they develop. And so it's an ideal model species. At least for me. I worked with fish before, but I fall in love with the flies.
But I mean, do you think it's also an animal model from which we can extrapolate easily to other species when it comes to its, in this case, its behavior? Or, I mean, do you think that evolutionary biologists use it a lot, mostly because of the advantages you just pointed out?
I mean, of course, you're a little bit restricted with the behaviors because, of course, they do not have a big behavioral repertoire like like a chimp. But so you're a little bit restricted to food and reproduction with the behaviors, but it's still super interesting. And then, of course, you can manipulate many things with you can alter the diet, you can isolate them, do many things with them. And then you have to be always a little bit careful with the extrapolation. I mean, many of the genes you find either homologs or analogs in the higher order animals, but I still think that you get good insights from the Drosophila.
Mm-hmm. And how does mate copying happen in Drosophila then?
So what we do is we collect virgins. So the flies, just when they close from the pupa, we separate them by the sexes, and then they need a little bit time to mature. And then when they are 3 days old, which is the perfect age for us, we take a female, put her in a little tube, and on the other side is another virgin female with 2 males that we before powdered in green or pink, so that we have 2 neutral, totally artificial phenotypes where the females don't have an initial preference for. And then the demonstrator female can choose between one of those males, while the other one is watching. So they are separated by a little glass piece so that they can really just watch, not get any other cues, what's going on in the other tube. And a Drosophila mating lasts 20 minutes. So they have plenty of time to see which color male was chosen by the demonstrator female. Yeah, and when the demonstrator copulation ended, we removed these demonstrators and insert new males, both again green and pink. And then we open the little cover slide so that the observer female can make her own choice. And then we just watch who she's choosing. And in most of the cases, she will pick the same colored male as the demonstrator female. And this is also something that we call a trait-based copying, because they go for the color and not for the individual male. Because one student did a mistake and always used the same males and found the complete opposite from all others. And then we thought, oh, why is it like this? And apparently they can really see, oh, this male just mated before and remember that. And probably due to fear of sperm depletion or anything else, they prefer not to take the same male immediately, but the next day they will copulate with him. So sometimes these mistakes give fascinating insights.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned females there specifically. Does mate copying also occur in males?
Yes, at one point I also tried it with the males, because there are very few examples from males knowing that they do mate copying, because usually it's assumed that the sex that is investing more into offspring is the choosy one. But I saw that sperm production in Drosophila is also quite expensive, so they should be choosy as well. So I did the same experiment with males, just powdered the females now, and then it was a little bit tricky because the females have control over mating. So even if the male wants to mate with the right color, it was not 100% sure that she would accept him. So there we had to look at the color of the female he directed his first courtship to. So he initially went to his preferred color, and then if she didn't want, he just took the other one. So a little bit pragmatic. Better low quality offspring than no offspring.
Right. And I mean, do we know what factors play a role in mate copying in Drosophila? I mean, are there specific conditions or contexts where mate copying occur and not others, or do they copy specific individuals, for example, or specific traits and not others? I mean, what factors really play a role here?
I mean, at this point, we're still at the beginning, because So we used these neutral colors and it worked perfectly. And then I did one experiment where we used a mutant, the curly wing mutant. I find them very cute, but the flies don't like them because they can't fly, and the song might be a little bit odd with these curly wings. And but there you can also induce or increase the preference for these curly wings. And so apparently there are traits in the flies that we can't see. And so we do not really know which traits they use in nature. They might go for size, they might go for body color. So all these, but we do not yet know who's a good demonstrator, female. So because for us, it made the difference if the demonstrator was a curly winged female or a straight winged female. It didn't matter, they would just go for it. Yeah, so, but this is a super exciting question that I would also love to see in the future. What are really the cues that they need to decide, yes, I copy her and not someone else?
But do you know if or do you see it occurring in some specific conditions and not others? Is that something you already have some answer to?
I mean, we always use virgin flies that have no initial preference or any experience with males. Maybe it would change later when they already made their own experiments. Of course, they look around in experiments where we looked if they would copy the majority, they would look what is picked by the other females and would go for it. Then we did some experiments with pictures where we altered both the males and the females a little bit. Then we found that we need good quality pictures to lead to this mate copying. And so if they're missing the eyes or the wings, they are apparently no good demonstrators. Probably they think this female has some health issues or whatever. But this is just at the beginning.
So 2D images can at least sometimes elicit mate copying in Drosophila?
Yes, I was the most surprised experimenter myself, because when we initially talked about it, I said, we can try, but it will never ever work. And indeed it did, and I was so surprised myself, because I thought the flies are not able to do that, because we just took pictures of copulating flies, printed them on photo paper and put them instead of live demonstrations. But so we just initially we took real pictures and saw that it worked. Maybe when so during copulation, the flies don't move. So maybe this played in our hands, because for them it was not so different from a not moving couple. But I was super surprised when it worked. And when it worked, we thought, wow, this is amazing. Now we can change everything. Now we started simplifying the pictures or just removing wings or eyes and stuff like this, just to see how much can we change the pictures before they stop copying. And this was a really fun experiment.
So pornography also works for Drosophila, I guess.
Yes. I mean, the big plan is later to use videos, because when I always do a lot of experiments per day, and then you need hundreds of flies per day. And if you have to collect all these virgins, it takes quite a lot of time. And especially we aspirate them. So we are not using any CO2 because it's very bad for the memory and might also change the behavior for several days. So yeah, it's a good training for your lungs if you have to collect all these virgins.
So let me ask you another question about mate copying in Drosophila. But are they only copying the acceptance of particular mates, or do they also copy the rejection?
So at least in our experiment, they copied only the acceptance of a male. So because usually we have this triangle, we have the female, the demonstrator female with the two males, and then the observer female is seeing, okay, this male is accepted, he's copulating, and the other one is apparently rejected. And then we did some experiments where we separated these two pieces of information, because a recently mated female is rejecting males from copulation. So we could just use an already mated female that is rejecting a male, or a virgin female that is accepting. And then we could easily disentangle these two pieces of information. And there we found that the rejection is not as a strong indicator than the acceptance. And this might have several reasons. As I said, the copulation is very long, so 20 minutes is a big chunk of information, while a rejection is often very short. It might be just the female fleeing or kicking the male away. And if you miss this, and on the other hand, it might not be due to the quality of the male. As I said, a recently mated female is rejecting any male, no matter how good his qualities are. So the observer female wouldn't know exactly why the demonstrator is rejecting. Is it because of the quality of the male, or is it just because she already mated? And as they do not get the pheromones of the already mated female, they don't know. So they really go for this positive information rather than the negative, which is amazing. There's only one other study looking at the rejection. It was in fish, and there they copied the rejection. So
yeah, that's very interesting. And do sex ratios have any influence here in mate copying in Drosophila?
yes, one of our PhD students did a little experiment. So we have a tool, the hexagon, where we have a centerpiece for the observer and the demonstrators are sitting around, and then we put more and more females as observers so that they know 5 other or 10 other females are watching together with me, and there are just these number of males around, so that they would feel there's a pressure to make a quick decision or to mate before the male is mating with someone else. And we found that it was okay, and up to a bunch of 12 observers together in this centerpiece. But when they were 24, they would just go for the first male they see and just accept the next best copulation, just because they felt, oh, otherwise I don't get one.
So, and is it the case that the individuals who copy mate choice in this case can be deceived by the choosers?
We do not know yet if this is the case in the flies, but in fish there is some deception. So first Martin Platt found this in Atlantic mollies, and there he was wondering why the demonstrator male went first to the lower quality female and was swimming around her pretending, oh, this female is super nice. And then the other male that was watching would also go to the smaller female. And yeah, I read these papers during my PhD and found this super interesting and thought, oh, I have to do this with myself and mollies. And so I did the same experiment as Martin. But then after this audience effect, this deception, I wanted to see, does this deception really works? And I let the observer swim around and made the choice. And then they would also really go to the small one, while the initial demonstrator would go for the big one. I found this really tricky. So there must be some cognitive processes about knowing if I do this, then the other one will do that, and quite tricky. But yeah, in the flies, we have to test it.
I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, what would be an explanation as to why sometimes the choosers deceive the audience, I guess?
It's a very simple way to secure paternity. So if he really gets a chance to mate with a high quality female alone, he will gain all the paternity of this offspring, while the other one then has offspring with a lower quality. But yeah, it's working out if he really gets a chance to mate with a high quality female. And maybe, I don't know if there's a way for the observer to hide somewhere so that it's not that obvious that the demonstrators watch during mate choice.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a few more questions about mate copying, but let me just make a small detour here to ask you about culture from an evolutionary perspective. So if we see social learning and social transmission of behavior occurring in particular species, does that imply culture, or should we assume that they have culture or some form of culture?
I mean, to me, social learning is really the keystone of culture. So if there's no social learning, there can't be culture. But yeah, I think for culture, you need a little bit more, because there you need this vertical transmission so that you have the transmission from one generation to the next, so that you can build up on a tradition. And from different traditions, a culture emerged. So you really need these long-lasting aspect of social learning over many, many generations.
So just observing social learning by itself, you think is not enough for us to claim that the species where we observe it as culture, right?
No, I would go a little step further, so that first of all, you need to show that there are social learning in this particular species, but then you would need to test, is there a transmission across age classes? Because when it's just peer-to-peer, it might just stay in this one generation, but not jump to the next one.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you need some kind of long-term memory for this. And so you would need to find some experiments where you can test that they remember it for a day, 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever. So because not always they can already directly use the information they observed immediately, because yeah, the male might be not available or whatever. And then yeah, if you have all this, it would be also great if they do not do this individual-based copying, so just learning to prefer this specific male, that they would build a preference for the trait, because this one male might die in a few weeks, and then what do you do with your preference? He's no more there, no chance to mate with him. So it's better to learn that this particular trait, the color of the feathers, or yeah, the size, body color, whatever, is the trait you should go for. And then you have also higher chances to find a suitable mate. And with all this, you have the first building block. But we modeled all this together with a collaborator. And then we had the problem that we couldn't get long-lasting traditions. It was always jumping back and forth. So we did it with the flies. So it was if they have a preference for green or pink, and it was always switching between green and pink. So yeah, nothing stable. But then in the human literature, conformity was discussed a lot. So just copying the majority or behaving as the majority. It's a very simple definition. And then we said, okay, we have to test this in the flies. If they go for the majority, they can, certain females mate with a low quality male, but in general, they would learn what is the high quality male. And if you do this and put it in the model, you get long-lasting traditions. So because then, yeah, you have a certain amount of errors in the system or mistakes, but it's still stable. So it's like a repair mechanism. And yeah, then you get long-lasting traditions and more cultures.
So there's also conformity in some non-human animal species.
Yes, and so it's relatively new, let's say, in studies of animals. So it started in the 2000s, I would say, that people started thinking about conformity in animals, and now there are a lot of examples all over the animal kingdom where they found conformity. It's in opening a puzzle box, in foraging techniques or food preferences. But up to now, only one example in mate choice in the fruit flies. So I would be happy if more people would look at this.
Right. But how do you study? You mentioned some of it, but how do you study conformity, for example, in Drosophila?
Yeah, for this, we had a tool that, yeah, the hexagon, or in the lab we always called it the peep show, with the centerpiece for the observers, and then we had 6 chambers around. Where we could put the demonstrators, and when you're super careful, you can transfer already mating pairs into these chambers, so that we could decide what the observers in the middle see. And then we could play a little bit with the ratios of green and pink couples. And there we found a super nice step function that as long as there's a majority for either green or pink, the observer females would go for the color chosen by the majority. And that was really exciting to find.
Conformity can also occur in mate copying?
Yes.
In Drosophila?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this then, because I started this section by asking you about social learning, and if we observe social learning in a particular species, if we should infer that they have culture. So how would you say, do you think that there are specific criteria to determine if a particular animal species has culture or not? So we mentioned social learning and its importance. You mentioned that vertical transmission of behavior is also, I think we could say, necessary. You've also referenced traditions and conformity. So, how do you really tackle the existence or inexistence of culture from the perspective of evolutionary biology?
I mean, I would now always go and testing these 5 criteria if it's possible. Of course, if you have a studies field site in the wild, it's much harder to make planned experiments. But there they often use this exclusion method, where they just go, oh, we find these particular behaviors in this population, while another one is lacking that one. And then they are looking for, are they genetically related? Is there exchange between populations? But to my opinion, it's much more blurry. Of course, most of the cases, this is the best you can do in the field. But if you have an animal that you can study in captivity, I think you should always go and just systematically test for these 5 criteria. Of course, you always have to adapt to your species, and not everything that I can do with the Drosophila is allowed to do with other individuals. Because, for example, for the long-term memory, we just fed some chemicals to the flies that would block protein synthesis, so that they technically couldn't build memory. And this is, of course, not allowed in other animals, or really hard to with all the RRV and whatever permits you need. But then you just have to think, how can you adapt these protocols to the needs of your species?
So, I mean, would it be fair to say that to really know if a particular species has some sort of a culture, we probably have to tackle it on a case-by-case basis? I mean, do you think there would be sort of universal criteria to determine if a species has culture or not that would apply to all species?
I mean, I wish there would be something like this, because right now there's still a debate. Should we all call it culture, or is it like a low-level culture, or
Yeah.
this is high culture, or whatever? And yeah, so especially if you go to invertebrates or fish, people are a bit reluctant to call it culture, while they are now, I think, okay with calling it a culture in whales or in chimps or even in birds. But yeah, it's still under debate if you should call it culture or not. But I think if you just have criteria that you can measure, then it should be all called culture.
Okay. So going back to mate copying for a second, do you think that do you think it has any consequences for the study and how we understand mate preferences? I mean, do you think that, for example, it contradicts or, on the other hand, might complement the research that points to evolved and somewhat fixed mate preferences in particular species?
Um, in the past, it was always assumed all this is due to genetic fixed preferences that are just there.
Yeah.
And there's a huge debate about the term innate. What is innate? And I think for many of the preferences, we do not even know where they are coming from, because a lot of this you acquire so early in life just by watching your parents. Then you know your father must be a high quality male because he got offspring. He was chosen by your mom. So there's very early a lot of learning. And before, it was always assumed that this wouldn't be the case. And they all have a preference for big ones, but no one knew why or where it's coming from. I mean, it's a very universal preference that you always go for the larger individuals, but I'm not sure if this is really all due to genes. And of course, with mate copying, you could also explain traits that don't look beneficial on the first sight, or that you see differences in population preferences, because maybe the green phenotype is more beneficial in one population while the pink one is doing better in another one. And as long as there's genetic or some flow between the populations, you can maintain the both phenotypes, just one is more popular in one than the other. But ultimately, it can also lead to speciation, I think, because then, yeah, you have suddenly all the pink ones died out and only the green ones are left, or the populations just split.
Right. So, I mean, I guess that when it comes to studying mate preferences from an evolutionary perspective, there are still many questions to be definitely answered, right? I mean, even if I think that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, one of the things that you are implying there is that even if we see some mate preferences for both males and females that seem to be universal in a particular species, assuming that they are genetic or innate in some other particular way. I mean, that is not necessarily the case.
I would say no. I mean, there might be, of course, good examples for it, but
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot early in life that is producing these preferences due to social learning.
What are the ways do you think that mate copying might impact sexual selection? I mean, because in evolutionary biology, through the framework of sexual selection, we know, or at least there's good evidence that some traits in males and females have evolved through sexual selection. So if there's mate copying, at least in certain species, do you think that would have any implications as to how sexual selection occurs, or how we think about it?
I mean, it's a good way to adapt to changing environments, because certainly a phenotype has some advantages over others. And then, of course, if a few or influential females are preferring this phenotype, it might spread easier in the population. And there are also some models showing that due to mate copying, even maladaptive traits can spread in a population. So I think, of course, it can have major implications for the evolution of the species and the evolution of the traits.
And does social learning, or can social learning influence other aspects of sexual behavior apart from mate copying?
I mean, Frédéric Méry, he did some experiments where he looked at females use, also in Drosophila, the presence of other females to find a good food patch to lay the eggs on, for example. So this is another example where social learning plays a role in reproduction.
Right. So, okay. So one last topic or question. We've talked a little bit about culture here today. Do you think that by studying culture and cultural transmission in non-human animals, we can get new insights into human culture?
Yes, I think so. Because, I mean, humans have very, very long generation times. So
Right.
I think you can do some experimental population experiments with animals, and you might also learn something about the mechanisms behind the social learning. And I think you can gain a lot from the non-human animals, and probably also finding the roots of cultural evolution, because it's nothing that humans invented. It has some evolutionary origins. So, and then seeing where it comes from seems to be super exciting.
Great. So, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
I have my own website, and then just Sabine Nöbel at wordpress.com. And then I have my Google Scholar page, or you can find me on Twitter. It's Nöbel Sabine. The other one is a fitness influencer. Sometimes it gives funny mismatches. Or just Google me, or right. You can always reach out, and I'm always happy to chat about my research.
Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been fun to talk to you.
Thank you for hosting me. It was my very first podcast and a super nice experience. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you. Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Per Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sunny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, the RPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.